Thank you for all for being here and online. I think this is going to be a great program. We have a stellar group of speakers and great audience both here and online. Just to remind you why we're here. President Putin announced several weeks ago that he intended to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, including construction of a bunker for the weapons by July 1st, and being able to deploy it on eastern plains and the Iskander missile. I'll introduce the panel itself in a few minutes, but first I'd like to start with opening remarks from Rose Gottemoeller. One of those cliches that, someone who doesn't need any introduction, but I'll introduce her anyway. Rose, as you know, is the Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Before that was the Undersecretary of Arms Control and International Security and the lead negotiator for the New START treaties. So Rose, great to have you here and welcome your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Miles. And it's truly great to be with you today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. Sarah and I guess we're both out in California, is that right? So in any event, I see from the list of participants that there's some really fantastic people online as well as in the room. So thank you all very much for coming today. I wanted to make just a few opening remarks to get at, I think, where we stand today in policy terms. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to speak to this group because it's been a matter of grave concern to me, and I think to us all, Russia's announcement that it plans to deploy weapons in Belarus. It clearly contradicts the commitments that Belarus and Russia made under the Trilateral Statement of 1994 that all nuclear weapons in Belarus would be moved to Russia for redeployment or elimination, and that Belarus would embrace the status of a non-nuclear weapon state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I know that Russia claims Belarus's status under the NPT will not change, but the fact that a new nuclear storage facility, as Miles just mentioned, is being built with great fanfare in Belarus to be ready by July 1st, and that Belarusian pilots are being trained with great fanfare to fly nuclear-capable aircraft runs against the spirit and letter of that earlier agreement. Of course, President Putin argues that he is doing no more than Washington has done with NATO for 60 years. However, I would like to emphasize that the nuclear sharing arrangements at NATO were front and center during the negotiation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the 1960s. The negotiating record, as William Alberque well knows, and I endorsed the piece he did on this several years ago, but the negotiating record of the NPT clearly shows that the USSR agreed to the arrangements at the time in order to assure that other NATO countries, such as Germany, did not acquire nuclear weapons of their own. Putin's decision takes a country that was clearly non-nuclear, Belarus, a status that was even inscribed in the Belarusian constitution, and provides it with new nuclear infrastructure and new nuclear knowledge. This is clearly a step backwards. While the Russian action is regrettable, this would be a good opportunity, I think, to follow up on the recent proposal by Senator Sam Nunn and Dr. Ernie Moniz of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And I noticed that Lynn Ruston is online today, and thank you, Lynn, for being here. They have proposed to have a U.S.-Russian dialogue on fail-safe mechanisms. The new generation of U.S. non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe, the B-61-12 gravity bombs, have enhanced their protections against nuclear accidents or theft. The B-61-12 contains an enhanced permissive action link system that precludes unlocking and arming of the weapon without a prescribed discrete code available only after presidential authorization. Arming is accomplished through a coded control device that uses a cryptographic algorithm. And I know we'll be talking more about cryptography this morning, but it's also been applied to the safety mechanisms on the B-61-12. And the system may be relocked without a code for enhanced protection. I very much hope that Russia has taken similar measures with regard to their non-strategic nuclear warheads, and I agree with Nunn and Moniz that it would be a good thing for the United States and Russia to discuss this matter. In closing, I'd like to stress that the anxiety around non-strategic or tactical nuclear warheads is that they have never been monitored in arms control treaties or agreements. Achieving constraints on these and other warheads is a clear objective of the United States in the next nuclear negotiation with Russia. And I sincerely believe that such negotiations continue to be in the mutual interest of both the United States and the Russian Federation. Our CNS team has developed an innovative warhead tracking system that could be a vital component of such a monitoring system. Miles Pomper, Bill Moon, and the panel will tell you more about that, as well as other issues. I wanted to apologize to you in advance that I must leave our session a bit early to get to Stanford to teach my class this morning, so I'll be departing at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time. With that, over to you, Miles, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Rose. So let me just give a little bit more of an introduction to our panelists, and then we'll kick off the discussion. Nikolai Sokov, who's with our Vienna Center, to my left, far left, was a arms control negotiator on the, what was it, INF Start 1?
INF Start 1,
PNIs, okay.
Start 2.
For the Soviet Union and then
everything's
Russia.
Gone now.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Bill Moon, to my immediate left, he said it was a Defense Threat Reduction Agency and was very involved in dismantlement of Russian, Soviet, I should say, systems, including in Belarus. So he's really has the on-the-ground truth there. William Alberque, who's to my immediate right, and now at IISS, is formerly with NATO, WMD Center. So I think you're going to give, as well as some additional information on Belarus, kind of give a NATO perspective. And Sarah Bidgood, who's online, is in our Monterey, California office, and is going to talk a little bit about the effect on the non-proliferation regime, particularly the NPT. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nikolai to get us started.
Thank you, Miles. As I said, it's really good to be back in the Washington office. So it's a very pleasant opportunity to speak here. So let me start with a few basic facts. Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, actually said back within the end of 21 that he wanted nuclear weapons of Russia within his territory. That was even before the war. The next stage came out in the summer last year, in the middle of the war. Well, the Russian offensive, was attempt to finish the war quickly had failed. So the war was really stalling. Lukashenko came to meet Putin in St. Petersburg and said once again that he wanted nuclear weapons. This time, Putin said, we don't really want to mirror the NATO nuclear sharing, but then he added that Russia will convert aircraft in Belarus Su-25s to carry nuclear weapons, but he also said that Russia will deliver Iskander tactical missiles, and he emphasized that they were dual capable. After that, it was more or less quiet. Although in the end of the year, it was announced that the conversion of the aircraft was going on. In March, events came once again to headlines. It was confirmed that the training of crews and conversion of aircraft was going on. It was also announced that the training of Iskander personnel in Belarus was also starting. Yes, and Putin announced that the storage facility should be completed by July 1. So I will not talk anymore about storage facilities until we'll tell you so much more. But what's really interesting about this whole story is that, at least on the Russian side, no one has really mentioned the transfer of nuclear weapons. All talk has been about conversion of aircraft, training crews, constructing the storage facility, but not really the transfer of nuclear weapons. That is not quite apparent at first glance, but I very carefully actually looked at all the Russian statements, which actually leads me to believe, even here I share the view of a number of people, with a number of experts, that probably the transfer of nuclear weapons will require a separate decision or a new signal. It would be in the interest of Russia to give as many signals as possible to escalate the situations step by step. Also, yes, I do think that right now they just plan to put the infrastructure in place to get ready for the transfer of weapons, but the actual transfer will be a separate step. Let me also note that there was a bit of discussion within Western media about the Chinese angle. Specifically, the announcement of Putin about construction of the nuclear storage facility, his training of crews and everything, was made literally a few days after the joint Chinese-Russian statement, which said that all nuclear weapons should be returned to national territories. Quite an obvious hint at the B-61s in Europe is a nuclear sharing inside NATO. So there was speculation in the West that the Chinese might be very unhappy, that only a few days later, actually, Putin violated that joint statement. I really doubt that there was any concern on the Chinese side or any surprise on the Chinese side, because in fact, the announcement initially was made last summer, so Chinese actually knew very well about what's going on. I simply think Putin will tell the Chinese that we waited with the transfer of weapons as long as we could, and it was really the last resort kind of thing. It's not our fault, and so forth. So I don't really think we'll see any problems within the Russian-Chinese relationship on this issue. So now let's talk about the strategic consequences. And these are many, and all of them are very unpleasant. The most obvious and apparent actually thing is that now Putin is really following the Soviet example with nuclear sharing. As we all know, for a long time, it's been a position of Russia that nuclear sharing of NATO violates the NPT. I think that Williams' actually work on nuclear sharing the legal status was so convincing that actually the Russians decided that, that yes, it's fine. Well, it's only in part actually a joke, because in fact, the Russian announcement, at least the way it was formulated by Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, actually sounded like a bit of a trolling. So yes, I'm pretty sure that an element of trolling was there, but anyway, they decided to go for nuclear sharing. The second significant development is that for the first time since 2000, the new military doctrine and all the limited nuclear use concepts. For the first time, tactical nuclear weapons, short-range nuclear weapons, acquire a distinct actual role. So yes, Russia did have all those concepts, all those strategies for limited nuclear use since 2000, but the emphasis was on the long-range systems, the strategic range and theater range systems. So for the first time, we see a role for the short-range systems, and that's a very significant development that will actually likely remain with us for a long time. Why deployment in Belarus? What does it add to Russian nuclear posture or to Russian strategy? I think the decision to go for that deployment can be understood in only one way. That's a very direct and focused actual signal to Poland. But in fact, from Belarus, Iskanders and aircraft can only actually strike targets in Poland. That's basically it. Yes, and we all know the role of Poland here, right? During the war, it's been at the forefront, also providing assistance to Ukraine. It's been exerting very strong pressure on other European countries to join the efforts, to provide tanks and so on and so forth. Poland, at the highest levels, has been always extremely vocal about, well, actually radical and far-reaching goals for that war. Well, he's been talking about the change of regime. He's been talking about sending Putin to The Hague. It was about really changing the whole political landscape in Russia, political system, everything. Please note that NATO and the European Union, in fact, do not have an agreed definition of defeat of Russia. Everyone says that they want the defeat of Russia in Ukraine. But what exactly does it mean? And we know the US position is just to liberate the territory of Ukraine. Yes, a similar position, as we know, is shared by Germany and France, for example, but a number of countries, but Poland, Baltic states, and Ukraine, of course, itself, actually want something significantly more actually radical. So I think, well, it should not be surprising to us that Russia decided, well, instead of leveraging nuclear weapons in a broad way, like the entire Europe, the entire continent, or, scale, to make a very focused, actually, threat specifically to Poland. Which basically means that if and when the Russian nuclear weapons will be transferred to Belarus, that will be an extremely powerful nuclear signal. Much more serious than what we heard actually last year at the beginning of the war, was in a few times afterwards, especially in September. Then it was done in general way, like all options are on the table and so on and so forth. Now that will be something vastly more tangible and something that we should really pay attention to as we go forward. Now, it really brings me to the last point I wanted to make, and that's about the actual kind of possibility of nuclear use, and how it might actually happen. As I know, it's very fashionable now to say that Russia will not use nuclear weapons, ever. Well, I think it's just fashion. Well, it was fashionable actually last fall to say that Russia is going to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine any moment or in any numbers. Then the fashion changed, and now we hear that Russia will not use nuclear weapons at all. There's all extremes, there's all fashions. I think both are actually wrong. Well, I think that in Moscow, they very clearly understand the grave consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. So quite obviously that will be reserved for the most grave kind of situation with a very serious defeat, when regime will be put at risk and so on and so forth. So it's not something that will really happen like in the next month or something. But the possibility is there. I do not expect a strike out of the blue. It's not going to happen. It's once again, the Russians will try to leverage nuclear weapons, but not actually use them. So we'll likely see an escalation. Probably more statements, transfer of nuclear weapons, possibly some altercations, in the air or at sea, possibly some use of conventional weapons. I would say that the last really stage of escalation that we might see is the underground nuclear tests. And Putin already mentioned that in late March. So I would say that if we see an underground nuclear test, that will be the signal that, well, it's really close. It's very serious. And the risk of escalation is further amplified by the simple fact that at the moment it's actually very rational for Russia to escalate. It's a rational choice. Really, it cannot afford to have the war continue for a long time. The next year, the situation for Russia at the front lines will likely be worse than actually this year. So they want to finish it. And the only way to affect the position of the West in this war is really put the West, to put NATO and the European Union, in front of a choice. Just how much you're going to pay for the victory of Ukraine. Are you prepared to accept a few nuclear explosions in your territory? Is it the right price? Are you going to take it? So escalation is the right choice to get the West to that decision point. But of course, as we now know, not long ago, in fact, the British plane was almost shot down by Russia by accident. So accidents can actually happen. But it was not a conscious decision or some part of Russia. So if you bring together the interest in escalation or in accidents that are bound to happen in a very tense atmosphere, well, I think it's not really a very kind of bright future that we're looking into for the next probably year or something like that. I think we need to be aware of the risks. I'm not saying that we should stop supporting Ukraine, quite obviously, but we need to be aware both of the risk and make decisions with full understanding of what they entail. So I suggest that the decision of Russia to go for nuclear sharing in Belarus is a far more fundamental and far-reaching, actually, development, and then it might seem at first glance. Also, yes, on the final note, I do not see the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine. I don't think that's really likely. I think the probability is extremely close to zero. If we talk about nuclear use, that's going to be territory of NATO. And please pay attention that now officially at the highest levels, both in Russia or the United States and NATO, was classified as party to the war. Yes, and that was a significant statement that only came out toward the end of last year. Well, it took them actually a long time to finally make that judgment. Yes, and we should not think it's simply rhetoric. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate being invited to speak today. I'm going to give you a little different perspective as a program manager, worked on the ground with both Belarus and Russia under the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. I was a project manager for the CTR program in Belarus from 93 to 95. That was the length of our cooperation, and we focused on eliminating the infrastructure of the SS-25 mobile ICBM systems. Well, we did eliminate 81 launch control facilities at those 3 sites. We were focused at the time on strategic systems, not tactical. And to support that effort, we did a little bit of environmental cleanup. The whole idea here was we wanted to eventually turn over the strategic rocket forces sites that were manned by Russian strategic rocket forces officers over to Belarus for civilian use. So we did, but we did not finish that job. When Lukashenko came into office, he started denying us access to those sites. So while we're happy that we eliminated all of the launch control facilities and a lot of the infrastructure, we did not complete elimination of the pads that are used for mobile ICBMs to launch. We had a contract in place, but that was halted, unfortunately. Before we did that work, all of the warheads in Belarus were shipped back to Russia, and they were shipped back by rail. That might be an indication that if warheads are going to be shipped into Belarus, it might use the same techniques and some of the same routes, depending on what sites. William's going to talk a little bit more about candidate sites. During our visit early on, I had the opportunity and was invited by the Russian Strategic Rocket Forces commander, the general, to go inside of an SS-25 warhead storage bunker. SS-25 warhead storage bunkers are not, at least the ones that we went into in Belarus, were not those concrete reinforced under the ground kind of bunkers you might think of. You know, those bunkers are designed to withstand a nuclear attack. SS-25 warhead storage was not like that. It was more of a temporary shelter, kind of the size of this room. It was sort of disguised, so you might not know what it was. In fact, he didn't even tell us what it was when we went in there, and we were eliminating infrastructure. So that's probably not the way that they're going to come in and put new warheads in. I wouldn't expect them. The reason there were temporary shelters for the 25s is the warheads usually would be on the ICBMs while they were out roaming the fields and hiding from targeting. They could, however, if they were to store the warheads in a super container. And we provided the Russians super containers for safe storage during transportation and during storage that would provide the protection if it was more of a temporary shelter instead of a deep underground bunker. After working in Belarus, I turned and started working with the 12th Main Directorate on nuclear security of warheads in Russia. For those of you who are not familiar, the 12th Main Directorate, or 12th GUMO, using the Russian acronym, They're responsible for the storage, maintenance, transportation, security of all nuclear warheads when they're not deployed on delivery systems. So they own all of the bunkers, big central sites, smaller sites that are near delivery systems. They own the bunkers that are there, all the personnel, all the rail cars. You see here a model of a guard car that is used during a rail shipment. This is where the guards are, they travel with the warheads. When the warheads are transferred from rail car to trucks, they'll sleep there for the week. Depends how long it takes to do that transfer, how big of a rail line it is. And they live and stay there. They're not allowed to meet with the people in the truck crews. They're not allowed to meet with the people in the rail transfer site that does security. These crews are segregated. In fact, there's a bulletproof glass where they do transfer of custody documentation. So it kind of gives you a signal of how the 12th Maine Directorate segregates itself from others. So first I'll make a couple comments about schedule that we may keep in mind as things develop. Putin announced that the bunker in Belarus would be completed by July. It's certainly possible to build or modify a structure in that time, but that's just putting the structure in place. We also have to think about all of the handling equipment that is required inside the bunker, usually overhead cranes. And what I want to emphasize too is for safety and security reasons, all of that heavy lift equipment has to be certified. They have an entire unit in St. Petersburg who does certification. In fact, we helped build a laboratory that they use to check on metallurgy to make sure things like cranes aren't going to break while they're lifting a warhead. So there may be activity there, or those personnel may be going around Russia and checking the infrastructure and checking on equipment that would need to be shipped into Belarus. So when even after all that's installed, you've got to put your comprehensive security system around a bunker. We did that security for all of the bunkers in and around Russia under our cooperative program over the 18 years I worked with them. All of the schedules to do the security system were about 9 to 12 months. It takes a long time to put in the 3 layers of fencing, to make sure the microwaves are correct, to train the crews, to put up a full-up security system. Could be done, of course, a little quicker, but that was pretty quick at the time through 2008, using both American and Russian contractors on site. So putting a security system in place, which would need to be there before the warhead is shipped in, could take that long. So to give you an idea of that. You know, they would have to manufacture and transport, install a lot of the heavy equipment. They would bring the HVAC systems from Russia. There's no way they would buy that kind of thing in Belarus or any other country, because they would check it out, make sure it was secure. The handling equipment has to be certified, checked. Certifying a crane is a long process. It could take months. If they're doing a new one, if they're going to move an old one, even that has to be recertified if it's moved. Signs of construction of a bunker might be pretty tough to identify if they're going to modify an existing structure, as you can imagine. And you know, the big question would be, would they, you know, build a bunker that's to the standard of withstanding a nuclear strike, as most of their bunkers are in Russia, or would they build something more temporary? But that would require then moving in super containers to provide that protection. So those are things to look for. Let me talk a little bit about transport. This is based on our experience working with the 12th GUMO, who is responsible for all transport of warheads throughout Russia. At this point in planning for a movement, they would be out on the lines, planning their routes, which rail lines they're going to take. Before every shipment, they clear those routes. And by that, I mean, They have crews that go out over the rail, make sure that there's no problems with the rail, so there's going to be no accidents, derailing. And given the state of rail in Russia, and I'm sure in Belarus, that's not a simple task. So making sure those rails are in good enough shape to put a warhead over it, which is much heavier than most other things. This is just the guard car. The cargo car looks the same from the outside, but of course has a tray that's pulled out in order to remove the warheads that are transported in there. So other things to look for as we're watching these developments. One of the first things they would be doing after inspecting the rail, planning their routes, you're going to start seeing shipments of big rolls of fencing. Fair amount of fencing to go around the three layers worth around, even if it's just one bunker. And those that fencing would come from Russia. And where would it come from Russia? Well, we actually worked with them. The 12th Main Directorate's central transportation hub is in Sergei Posad. It's at a location called Abramovo. We did a lot of work there, and all of our assistance, all the equipment we provide, all the security equipment, was always transported through Abramovo. And next to Abramovo is also the training site where they train their security crews. They do that. Crews from all over their sites come and do that every so often, so they remain certified. The training site is set up so that a crew can formulate all of the security systems in a way that it resembles the site where they're going to be assigned. So at this point or soon, if they're going to move warheads pretty quickly, they'd have to be identifying a crew. Is it a new crew? Are they bringing a crew from another site? Could be extra activity in Abramovo, in Sergei Posad at the training facility. They'd have to replan their schedules for training, which is something we were very involved in because we expanded that site so that they could train more crews more regularly. So talking about personnel, I could not imagine them storing warheads in Belarus without the 12th Main Directorate being responsible permanently for the security there. There's just no way that would happen. They would maintain control throughout the lifetime of any warhead. And in fact, keep in mind, even if a warhead is not there, a 12th Main Directorate site would be responsible for maintaining a security site, even if the warhead has left, but it might come back. In other words, they don't just abandon a site in between times when they're storing a warhead. We know this because we help secure the rail transfer points. And we had a lot of discussion. Why would you secure a rail transfer point? It's not always, why can't you just secure it when you're doing that? Well, we want to make sure there are not things planted in between. We need to maintain those areas secure for all times. So there's no way that they would put a warhead in and not have the 12th Main Directorate watch the security for it the entire time. Then the 12th Main Directorate crews, they would be separate from Belarus. They would not talk to any military crews. You've heard about training Belarusian crews. That's training on the delivery systems, on the aircraft. That's not training on handling warheads. Okay, in Russia, 12th Main Directorate, depends, there could be Air Force crews in Russia that could be involved in the handling and placing of the delivery system if they're certified. But in other cases, if they're not certified or not up to speed, it's the 12th Main Directorate that does all of that handling. There's no way they would train a Belarusian crew to do that kind of activity. So they'd have their own separate housing. They'd have to modify or obtain housing. If you can imagine a big Russian crew from the 12th Main Directorate, they're not going to want Belarus level of housing, maybe something a little nicer, right? If you think about it, right, this is a very elite crews in Russia. They would, so I would think they're looking for housing right now. Where would they live? And we're not talking about 10 or 12 people here, right? If you're maintaining, we design the security systems. Security systems got about 9 stations that have to be operated 24/7, 365. If you start multiplying that out, you know, you've got 1 crew, you probably have at least 3 crews to cover that. Then you've got the maintainers of the warhead. You've got response forces, security response forces, and the guards. All of them have to be trained. They're going to have to come from somewhere. We're talking about crews, could be 100 people. You know, maybe they'll go a little bit fewer than that, but you know, I can't imagine they would have a lower level of security. It's not in the 12th Main Directorate's DNA to change or lower their security standards. They're going to have the same level of security standards, if not more, right? Because if they're outside of Russia. So could be 100 people. They'll need their own housing. Of course, it could depend on the number of bunkers, could be even more about that. So, you know, as we're looking for this bunker, there's the obvious things to look for, like the 3-layer fencing and security systems, just like in Russia. But these other things I hope might be helpful for those who are watching and interested in the developments to help you identify and discern exactly what the Russians are doing at whatever site. And I think I'm really teeing things up for William now, who's going to talk about some ideas about what routes and what things they're going to do.
Can we see the briefing, please?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Michael, how do you say his last name? Duitsman did some great work looking at satellite imagery of the former Soviet facilities in Belarus and put a bunch of them online. I went through, looked at it again, found a couple things he didn't find, and came up with my own overview based heavily on everything that Bill has said in order to make this a little bit more practical and show you exactly what it is we're talking about. Something that Rose said, by the way, just to build on what she said. So if you haven't read the paper I wrote for IFRI 2017 on NATO and the NPT, I really recommend you read it. Not only did the USSR agree to NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements being completely compatible with the treaty, the US and the Soviets actually drafted the treaty. They drafted Article 1 and 2. They met in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, September 20th to September 28th, 1966. And the memo at the end of that meeting was Soviet changes to the NPT text to accommodate NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. This was not some little mystery or trick. It wasn't grandfathered in. It was specifically written to allow this. The US delegation actually said to the Soviets, we assume you want to do the same thing. The Soviets said, no, we would never do this. They actually did. We know they did in Hungary. We're not sure about there's mixed evidence for Poland and East Germany, but we know they trained Hungarian crews to fly and launch nuclear missiles. So also, Kaliningrad versus Belarus. Belarus adds a couple extra targets to you. It changes some of the geometry, especially for the SS-26 launches, because it allows Russia to cover slightly more of Hungary, Romania, obviously, as we've seen in this conflict, all of Ukraine. But yeah, from Kaliningrad, they can already hit a bunch of targets. The real question, for those of you who have been following the Russian Iskander developments very closely, originally all the Iskander brigades had 3 battalions of the Iskanders. They added a 4th battalion, and we believe that 4th battalion may be 9M729s. So the real question for me isn't just the Iskanders in Belarus, but whether or not they'll put the 9M729, which has range of about 2,000, 2,500 kilometers, which does open up from Belarusian territory additional targets in Spain and Portugal that are harder to reach from Kaliningrad or Russian territory. So just something to think about moving forward. Belarus in the Cold War used to house SS-4s, SS-20s, and the SS-25 missiles. Next slide, please. I've also gone through, this is the Belarusian current rail map, because I wanted to see if they're going to go in, how they're going to go in. Next slide, please. This is a map of the current Belarusian military facilities. I've circled all the ones that I think are candidates for nuclear storage. Next slide, please. This is Michael's map. And I've circled the ones that I think are most likely to be nuclear, potential to be nuclear sites. But these are the 12 GUMO sites all across. And you can see the RSD-10, that's the Pioneer, that's the SS-20. The R-12, that's the SS-25, right? I think. Anyway, next slide, please. Another lovely Belarusian map of their former nuclear sites. Next slide, please. So, as Bill said, up in the upper right corner, that's Sergei Posad. That's where the 12th GUMO training support,
Central training,
everything is. So there's going to have to be trains from Sergei Posad to wherever the storage site is going to be in Belarus. And you can see, so Sergei Posad's up there. Then the next site to the right there with the reddish square around it, that's Bryansk 18. That's a Russian central storage facility. They call it the S facilities.
Yes.
That's a large storage facility. That's likely where they're going to come from. It's possible that they could use Belgorod 20, but that's 10 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. This one seems more likely, but that could be wrong. But I think of all the Russian central storage facilities, this is the one that's most likely to supply Belarus. Next slide, please. This is Sergei Posad from the air. Very large facility, lots of different things going on there for training, for maneuvers, for storage, everything. But you can look at it. So it's easy to find on Google Maps. Next slide. Okay, so now let's look at Bryansk. Next slide. This is the Bryansk facility. These are two separate locations within Bryansk. I think the one on the right that looks to be the main facility. The one on the left, a lot of storage, but this is a very large facility. There's a number of sub-facilities associated with Bryansk. And again, you can take a look at them on Google Maps. Next slide, please. This is the railhead. This is what Bill was talking about, where they will do the road to rail transfer point for nuclear weapons coming out of Bryansk. Next slide, please. So now let's go look at the 465th Missile Brigade, because where are the Iskanders? The Iskanders are at the 465th Missile Brigade. We know this. On December, what date was that? Sorry, December 19th, Lukashenko and Putin, 2022, Lukashenko and Putin met and announced that the Iskanders had arrived on February 1, Belarus, 2023, Belarus announced that they had full autonomous control of the Iskander-Ms. And by the way, let's remember in all of this, Russia has transferred the Iskander-M to Belarus. They've done this. The Iskander-M is #1 nuclear capable, which means it has the warhead capacity necessary to deliver, and it has a 500-kilometer range. Is this not a violation of the MTCR? Did I miss something? Transferring category 1? Anyway, maybe I missed something, but no one has mentioned this yet. I'm surprised. Anyway, so next slide, please. Let's look at the 465th Missile Brigade. Here it is. Lovely headquarters. Unfortunately, with Belarus, they don't have the street view of a lot of these facilities. A lot of the Russian facilities, you get a nice street view, so you can go up to the gate. But in Belarus, I guess the Google truck didn't get around very much, so you can't see that as much. Next slide, please. But no obvious nuclear storage at the 465th, but right next door is this disbanded facility. I don't know about you, that doesn't look like a disbanded facility to me. That looks like triple fences and stuff. I mean, it looks like an active ammunition storage anyway. So, I mean, is it possible that they could refurbish that or at least stick some super containers in there? And it used to be the 5th Guards Tank Army. And again, it was supposed to be abandoned, I think in 1994. That's not an abandoned facility. Now, it may be that this is a commercial facility that just has lots of guards and gates and guns. I don't know. I haven't been there, so I can't tell you. But at least it's a candidate. Like if I'm Russian, I'm looking at infrastructure and I don't want to greenfield something, that could be a useful place. Next slide, please. And so how would you get there? You see, all right, so the black line is the direct route. It's 225 miles as the bird flies. The train, you have to make a couple of turns there. And then, all the way on the left, 2 is the 465th and 3 is that storage facility I saw right next to it. The other little blue thing right north of the 2 is the 336th Missile Brigade. It's the other Belarusian Missile Brigade. But I don't think they're going to get it because the 465th, first of all, we have photography of the 465th playing with the Iskanders. And by the way, not just the Iskander-M, but also the associated cruise missile. So they got not just the SRBMs, they also got the SRCMs. But 336 doesn't do the Tachka. The 465th has the Tachka, so it also makes sense that the 465th would get it. Sergei Posad would have to come in from the other direction because of the way the train lines go into Belarus. Next slide, please. The railhead nearby doesn't look great. That's going to need some maintenance. Clearly, if that's going to be the rail-to-road transfer for the missiles to, or the warhead, sorry, to roll in, but this is one of the sites that you could look at. This is near Azapovici, which is right next to the 465th. There's a couple other potential rail transfer points. It's not the only one, but I would certainly be putting a satellite on that. Next slide, please. Now let's look at number 4, the Belarus Air Base. So Belarus Air Base, next slide. It's a very, very capable, very modern air base. They fly the MiG-29, the Su-30, and the Su-24 out of here. Now there's a lot of confusion as to exactly what aircraft the Belarusians have modified. If you'll recall the actual speech where Lukashenko asks Putin, I need more deterrence and I want missiles and I want 25 missiles. And Putin says, oh, the Su-25, okay. And you can see actually in the speech, Lukashenko says, what? Su-25s? Yeah, Su-25s. I'll upgrade your Su-25s for you. By the way, it is funny that Lukashenko, when he said that his aircraft were refurbished, what date did he say that? I think that was in December 23. He said, my Su-24s have been upgraded by Russia. He didn't say the Su-25s. He said Su-24s, and I got that off the Belarusian website.
I'm just looking at the announcement by the Belarusian Defense Ministry. As of today, that was tweeted by Hans, and they say the Su-25s.
Okay.
I'm surprised.
It was August 26, 22. Lukashenko said they were Su-24s. I don't know. This is just some of the fun confusion. But if they were going to be Su-24s, the Belarus Air Base storage used to store nuclear weapons. Next slide, please. It's good enough. I mean, again, you could refurbish that if you wanted. You don't have to, but you could. Next slide, please. And again, the route in, you'd either take the northern route through Mogliev, or you go through the southern route through Homel. Homel used to be one of the big 12th Gumo central storage sites. It is totally greenfielded now. If you look at it, it is completely overgrown with weeds. There ain't nothing there. And Sergei Posad would come through Minsk. Next slide, please. And the railhead there is beautiful. I mean, I don't think you're gonna need to do much. And by the way, that's the airfield in the upper left. So the railhead is literally a stone's throw from the airbase. Good connection and good housing as well. Next slide. Then we're gonna look at Bykhovsky Airport. Next slide. I don't think this one's likely. Bykhovsky's not a major strike airport. Next slide. There's a storage facility there. I mean, that looks good. That's a good storage facility. It's got some nice bunkers, got some lightning arresters. That's okay. Next slide. There's a facility nearby, Bychov. It used to be part of the 12th Gumo. That's weapon storage there. A couple bunkers. But I don't know. I don't think Bychov. Next slide. I also looked at Belarus, but I don't think Belarus will be upgraded either. And there's the train. And Sergei Posad and the warheads could meet up at Mogliev and go down. Who knows? Next slide. But again, I don't think so. Now, what the Belarusians said at least a couple of weeks ago was that they were going to put them in the far west of the country. The furthest west place would be Lida Air Base, and Lida Air Base is home to, next slide, all of Belarus's Su-25s. So if it is the Su-25, it's going to be there. And again, Lida Air Base has good weapon storage. And again, that used to be nuclear storage way back when. So, could they refurbish it and turn it into nuke? Possibly. Next slide. There it is. And you can see the old Su-25s just sitting there waiting for, give me bombs. Next slide. Getting to Lida is a little bit more complicated. As you can see, there's a bunch of different train routes they could take to get there, but there's no direct Minsk to Lida rail. You have to either go through Belarus or go up north. Next slide. And finally, I found this base, the 231st Artillery Brigade. Next slide, please. It's It's nice looking. They used to have nuclear artillery here back in the Cold War. Next slide. Pain to get to all the way in the west, up there by Poland and Lithuania. Next slide. And just to show you a couple of things that Bill was talking about, bottom left, there's his lovely little rail car. Bottom center, that's one of the nuclear trucks. It's from the 80s. Obviously, they have newer models now. In the lower right and in the center upper, you see this is a machine, used to be the TSCR-25. The one top center is the TAKT-51. They're now using the TAKT-52-01. This is the machine they use to certify, to check a warhead stats. So it assays the material and makes sure that it's still a viable device. It's in all their transport equipment and they have them truck mounted and train mounted, but they also have the wheelie version if you need to just roll them around. And that's them in the upper left using the TAK-51. Next slide, please. On the left there, got your lovely little containers in one of these bunkers. And then on the right, those are, I forget which one, object, not 244. It's one of the freefall bombs, roughly B-61 era freefall Soviet nuclear airdrop bombs. Very hard to find data on what the new airdropped bombs are. There's certainly no photographs I've seen online. I've looked through Russian literature. We know they have them. They say that they have them, and we've seen the training bomb. We know exactly what that looks like. We've seen them fly the training bomb, but I've never seen a designation. Even the Russian literature refers to an American author who made up a designation like the T-1200 or something like that. But I've talked to my Russian colleagues. One of them said, "I've got it for you," and he gave me the Isdela 244. And it's like, yeah, that's 1957. Thanks. Next slide. And some more pictures of containers. The containers in the upper right, that's old artillery nuclear container, super containers, and some pictures of the railheads. But anyway, just to make all that a little bit more visual for you so you can see what's happening. I was supposed to talk about NATO's reaction, and I apologize, I went off on this little tangent. And one last little tangent, it is worth putting the President Putin's statement in context. China is very worried, if you're not following East Asian security, because the South Korean debate on US nuclear weapons is enormous. It is taking up a lot of bandwidth. There is huge support in South Korea for the return of US nuclear weapons to the peninsula. The Yoon government wants more extended deterrence guarantees. And if you look at the November 2022 statement, the Nuclear Consultative Meeting, the NCM, between Austin and National Minister of Defense Lee, basically the takeaway is that the United States is going to increase its deterrence in the peninsula to the point that it appears it's rotational, but it will have the force of permanent basing. That's what the Koreans took away. That's what the Koreans announced in December. Better joint exercises, more presence. So in that context, a Xi Putin statement on non-basing outside territory makes perfect sense. However, it makes Putin's reversal a little bit more confusing because the South Koreans are saying, hey, we agree with Putin, not Xi. So I just want to give you that context. Now on NATO's reaction, NATO has very purposely been very measured. They've been mirroring the US language on this. So immediately after the Russian announcement, the State Department said, we condemn the announcement. It's an example of irresponsible nuclear rhetoric that we've seen from Russia, but we have not seen any reason to adjust our own strategic nuclear posture, nor any indications that Russia is preparing to use a nuclear weapon. Oana Longesco echoed these comments on November 26th. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on the 3rd and 4th, similarly, I mean, using very, very similar language. But he actually commented on China. He said, we know that Russia is more dependent on China. I believe the announcement that Russia will deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus right after they signed an agreement stating the opposite shows how empty Russia's promises are. But they also say, we haven't seen any changes in the nuclear posture that require changes to our posture. We're vigilant. We're watching this very carefully. So clearly, NATO is trying to be very guarded in this. But within the alliance, you're going to see tremendously different reactions. Obviously, Poland and Lithuania are on the border of Belarus. They're going to, and Slovakia, and Hungary, and the central and the Central European states, the CEE states within NATO, are going to react very differently than, say, France or Spain or Portugal, or even the UK in this regard, because short-range nuclear missiles are going to hit these shorter-range targets. And the Su-25, if that's the aircraft, Su-25 is not a deep penetration aircraft. This is a close air support aircraft. It is, that's not going to penetrate NATO air defenses. If you actually look at the old Soviet doctrine on this type of aircraft dropping an airdrop bomb, what they do is the lift and toss method. They have a special, actually a special mount that you put on the Tu-22s. So you pull your nose up really hard and the bomb releases and can fly a couple kilometers. The Russians also have a really interesting strategy. NATO pilots usually get special glasses to defend their eyes. The Russians have to pick an eye. You get an eye patch. It's true, absolutely true. So it'll be really interesting to see. But this will cause some divisions within the alliance, because there will be countries like Poland who have already had a debate internally about increasing deterrence, huge pressure within the alliance to improve deterrence capabilities, to add additional options. There are allies who are talking about, maybe we need an air-launched version. Those allies who don't want to change the nuclear posture on the ground within the alliance are very heavily leaning back on the slick amend. Unfortunately, some of the allies who are most arms control-ish and most allergic to changing nuclear postures say slick amend would be easier because then we don't have a basing. It's not a NATO issue, it's a US issue. And I've heard this from a number of different allies as part of a different project with Miles. We interviewed, I think it was 14 different allies about this. So it'll be very interesting to watch how this debate plays out within the alliance, not just on nuclear options, but then on integrated air and missile defense. This is going to put huge pressure on the NATO alliance to improve missile defenses, which we've always said are not aimed at Russia. Well, for Poland, they're going to say, well, all right, we'll aim it at Belarus. I don't care, but we can't have missiles. We can't have Russia with permissive opportunity to strike targets, short-range targets within the alliance from ground-launched missiles. And to people who say, well, you could already cover it with air and sea-launched, of course, the difference between ground and air and sea-launched is ground-launched. You can load these things onto trucks. You can hide them in the forest for weeks. Air-launched, it's in the air. You can spot when it's in the air and it has to land. It runs out of fuel. Sea-launched, you can watch them sail. And presumably, if it's a Russian ship in the Baltic Sea, you can put them on the bottom of the ocean in a heartbeat. Finding trucks in the forest is hard. Higher operational readiness. And the Russians themselves in their doctrine, they call the forest, the taiga, they call it their own ocean. They see that like subs in the ocean. So this does add some crisis opportunities to ramp up tension by moving things visibly. It doesn't necessarily change the target status, but it does change the way we feel about the Russian ability to strike certain targets. So expect a huge debate at NATO for new nuclear options, new integrated air and missile defense options, and bad times all around. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Another happy. I don't know if I add just on the South Korean debate. I mean, they talk about nuclear sharing specifically, so it's not just.
As President Yoon said, if U.S. extended deterrence guarantees are not good enough, we have the capability, the technological know-how, and the will to do it. Our own.
So, Sarah?
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, awesome. Okay. Well, what a pleasure to be on this distinguished panel. I will say it's tough to follow such excellent presentations and to say new things because we've covered a lot of ground here. But what I'm going to do to kind of round out our conversation is to underscore some of what we've already heard, but by looking through the lens of what we think the reaction to Russia's plans, if they actually materialize, might be among non-proliferation treaty state parties, and specifically at the next NPT PrepCom, which is coming up pretty soon in August. Part of the reason why sort of this angle of this issue particularly interests me, as Rose mentioned in her introduction, is that this question of nuclear sharing has come up repeatedly in the NPT context over time, including in its drafting. And just to sort of reiterate some of the points that William made, I mean, he's found that in the text of the treaty itself, it was written by its drafters, including the USSR, specifically so that NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements would be compatible with those no transfer provisions that are written into the treaty. But as others have also alluded to, beginning in 2015, the Russian delegation to the NPT really started to claim that NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements were in fact incompatible with the treaty. So that was a real change from what had been agreed to previously. And just to give you some detail here, in the 2022 review conference, for example, they delivered a statement in Main Committee 2 where they argued that NATO joint missions run counter to the letter and the spirit of the treaty. And they made this point that even though NATO members purport to want nuclear risk reduction, the forward deployment of US nuclear weapons on their territory, in fact, would increase this risk. So that was kind of the argument that they put forward to describe and underpin their position. I wanted to sort of reiterate this again, even though we've heard it a couple of different times, because when Putin announced his plans to station Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus last month, I was really struck, as it sounds like others were, by how much his words seemed to depart from what the Russian position had been on this issue up until very recently. So instead of saying that what the United States was doing ran counter to the NPT, as we heard previously, he made the explicit point to say that the United States has long deployed their tactical nuclear weapons on the territories of allied countries, and that Russia would do so too, and I'll quote him here, without violating our international obligations on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So, in other words, rather than criticizing what the United States was doing and sort of highlighting how Russia was behaving different, almost as a way to sort of retain the moral upper hand there, he now appeared to be leaning into that same behavior. And it seems to me that this framing is very clearly intended on some level to forestall any critiques that the United States or its allies might potentially level against Russia in regard to this issue. I think that determining how to respond to these plans against this backdrop is going to pose quite a quandary for some of the key players in the NPT, particularly the non-aligned and China. So for the NAM, that's in part because this group has objected for a very long time to nuclear sharing. As they put it, they object to this under any circumstances and any kind of security arrangements, including in the framework of military alliances. So they're very explicit, and they reiterated this in 2022 as well. So it's not just a sort of longstanding past position. This is a current part of the NAM view. China, for the reasons that William just described in his remarks, also opposes the deployment of nuclear weapons abroad and believes that nuclear weapon states should withdraw nuclear weapons deployed outside of their territory. And we know that this is still the Chinese position because, as many of us have mentioned on this call, on this meeting, one of the huge ironies amidst all of this is that she reaffirmed this view in the joint statement on Ukraine that he issued with Putin just days before Putin announced these plans to deploy non-strategic nuclear weapons in Belarus. So with this in mind, the big question for me as somebody who's sort of focused on this intersection of US-Russia issues, Russia-NATO issues, but also the nuclear non-proliferation regime is, will the NAM and China be prepared to speak out against Russia's actions at the NPT if Russia does in fact go ahead with the stationing of its tactical nuclear weapons abroad on the timeline that it's laid out? And, there are many caveats here that we've already discussed. Based on what I've just said about sort of the longstanding positions of NAM and China, you might think that the answer is absolutely yes, but I don't think that we can really count on that being a sure thing. That's in part because, much of the global South has been very reluctant to join the West in condemning Russia for any actions related to its invasion of Ukraine, in part because of what is seen by some as a contradiction between, for example, the US's opposition to Russia's behavior and its own actions in places like Iraq and Libya. So with that in mind, I suspect that there's going to be similar reluctance on the part of a number of these countries to criticize Russia if it does go ahead with its plans in Belarus. Although, of course, what might get lost in the shuffle here for those who kind of espouse that view or see things in this way is the fact that what Russia is proposing to do actually goes, beyond current U.S. practices with respect to the deployment of forward-based nuclear weapons for allied missile forces. Making things, even more complicated here, at least for the NAM, is the diversity of parties that make up that group. Not only does this include staunch disarmament advocates, many of whom are now members and states parties to the TPNW, but it also includes Belarus itself. China, for its part, has been an observer to the NAM since the 1990s, and Russia just became one in 2021. So it is now an official observer to the NAM as well. So with this in mind, I think we have to ask, is there really any way that this group with all of these very different priorities and threat perceptions and security concerns and considerations, would be able to reach a united position on the issue of nuclear sharing, whatever that position might be, as it has in the past. That's something that I can't say for sure for now, although I think we'll probably know more in August. But what I would imagine is that, some of these countries will attempt to navigate this kind of sticky issue by continuing to criticize the forward deployment of nuclear weapons generally in their national capacities, but without specifically mentioning, the countries to whom those critiques might be directed. And of course, the irony here, again, is that Russia would probably now oppose the inclusion of any kind of language along those lines in a consensus document, which is a complete contrast with what their position has been over the course of the last review cycle. As a result, I think that this is an issue that has the potential to become as divisive as the issue of attacks on peaceful nuclear installations was during the 2022 RevCon. And for those of you who weren't there, that was really one of these issues that kind of dominated the conversation. Of course, there's no requirement to reach any kind of consensus outcome document at this next PrepCom. It's the first PrepCom in a new cycle. But I do think that this debate over this issue could be very disruptive and dominating at a time when, the NPT has no shortage of other challenges that it needs to deal with over this coming review cycle. I think just kind of in closing here, the last point I really want to underscore that I don't think we've really talked about that much on this panel is just what a dramatic about face Belarus's position is with respect to the forward deployment of Russian weapons on its territory. Bill Potter, who's our director at CNS, has written extensively about the sort of politics of nuclear renunciation. And one of the points that he's made in his scholarship is that, Belarus actually wanted to join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state prior to its opening for signature in 1968. Moscow put the kibosh on that. But then in 1990, again, Belarus tried to advocate for establishing what it was referring to as a nuclear-free belt, along with Ukraine and the Baltic states and other countries in Central Europe at the UN General Assembly that year. It continued to even push for that idea and to explore, the possibility of things like HEU-free zones in the region into the 2010s. So, this was very much a part of its national position. I'm pointing this out because even though Belarus's constitutional changes, which removed its nuclear weapon-free status in 2022, drew almost no reaction whatsoever at the last NPT review conference, I think we need to be very clear as analysts that this represents a very significant departure from the past. And so I guess what remains to be seen for me is whether Russia, in acting upon those changes, will draw a more forceful response from countries that claim to, oppose the deployment of nuclear weapons outside of nuclear weapon states' territories, or whether those objections actually only apply when we're talking about NATO. So I think I'll leave it here, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. I see Rose has still managed to be with us at least for a second or two. So I wanted to make sure.
I really am going to have to run now, Miles. I wanted to hear what Sarah had to say, but thank you all so far for a great discussion, and apologies that I have to leave. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
And with that, I think we can take questions. Let's try to alternate, I think, between in the room and online, maybe. We have some questions I see already have come in right then.
Yep, there's a 1 second.
So why don't we have someone in the room have a question? All right. Hans?
Yeah, I would like to hear, Sarah, on your view about whether, given the fact that the country could argue that now the two sides, so to speak, are equally bad, and therefore the international community must stand together and do something special that has sort of an overall messaging rather than nitpicking with one or the other side. Do you think it's going to be quiet, or do you think it's going to be some attempt to articulate some of that?
Miles, do you want to collect questions, or should I take this one?
Just
okay, great. Well, I mean, I think, as I hope to sort of underscore in my remarks, I think it really depends on what kind of other ancillary considerations these countries are trying to deal with. So I do think, if it is in fact the case that the countries in the NPT about whom I was referring are opposed to nuclear sharing in general, then yes, I think it makes sense that they should continue to sort of uphold those positions, whether or not that challenges or makes their relationship with Russia more difficult. What I think remains to be seen is whether they're actually going to do that. And so this really comes down to sort of bigger questions that we see here about, for countries who are growing closer to Russia and have grown closer to Russia since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, are they going to be willing to kind of sacrifice the closeness of that relationship to take a principled stand against something that they actually believe is a violation of the NPT? Or are they going to remain quiet or sort of espouse some position that's somewhere in between there, where they're speaking out against NATO, against nuclear sharing, but they're not specifying which country they're referring to when they say that, to leave it a little bit more ambiguous? And would they be willing to accept some kind of outcome document at a further point in the review process, where that is left unsaid, or whether that language is excluded entirely? And I think that's really what we don't know. So that's a place where, for scholars, it's going to be very interesting to sort of see the impact of Russia's relationship with the global South on the nuclear order, on multilateral nuclear diplomacy more broadly. But this will be a test case. I don't think we really know the answer to that yet. So sorry, a sort of unsatisfying answer, but I'm going to be looking out for the empirical evidence when it comes time for the review conference and the review process more generally.
So before I go to the online audit, I realized I wanted to say something at the end, which was some of our work in this area that's relevant. So I think William mentioned earlier, we started with a project on non-strategic nuclear warheads. Some of you were helpful, Hans, I know it's helpful in some of this work, that looked at the NATO warheads in Europe, and if there was negotiation, this is of course when the strategic stability talks with Russia were underway at the beginning of the administration. If there's a negotiation, what are the political, legal, and technical issues that are relevant to putting those in a negotiation? That was out about a year ago and called Everything Counts. And then we followed that up with two projects funded by the State Department Verification Fund. Thanks, Neil, for State Department support. And that Bill's been the real technical lead on those projects. One was developing what we call a warhead tracking system that uses cryptology and other historic data to track warheads through sort of the logistical history. And Bill can tell you more about that in the Q&A if you want. And then we're taking that and building a full verification protocol that uses that as kind of the platform for putting various verification technologies with that. So thanks, Neil. I'm happy to talk more about that work in detail, but I did want to cite that in part because this could be relevant to Belarus. Online.
Hi. The question's up.
All right. First question. What are the potential justifications by the U.S. and its allies to oppose Russian intent to deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus?
None. as long as the Belarusians don't have the ability or a vote in initiating nuclear strikes before general war breaks out, then it's consistent with the treaty. The Soviets were absolutely insistent that once general war broke out, the treaty would no longer hold because one of the purposes of the treaty in the preamble was the prevention of nuclear war. Now, you can argue with that, but that's what they said in the 18-Nation Disarmament Committee. That's what everyone agreed to. This wasn't some secret thing. This was what was agreed to. So as long as they're not giving peacetime control over the nuclear weapons to the Belarusians, it's consistent with the treaty.
I guess
actually, well, there are very good reasons, I think, to oppose. Yes, and the reason is that you got a new deployment. It's a new posture. Yes, the nuclear weapons are much closer to the front lines, to the border with NATO. So it's really a threat with nuclear weapons. So yes, very good reasons to oppose. But of course, you cannot oppose on the grounds of the NPT. As I fully agree with that.
But I guess Rose was making the point that on the legal basis, it was more of a violation of the commitments under. Was that under Budapest Memorandum?
Mentioned before, yeah.
the Belarusians, I guess, would be the violators in a sense more than the Russians. Any other question in the room? No, Matt?
Sure. Thanks so much. This is fantastic. Do folks have a I guess an estimate, if you had to put in the percentage breakdown of how much this move is being driven by Putin versus how much this move is being driven by Lukashenko? I know Lukashenko was sort of the one who initially, pushed for this conversation, Putin sort of backed off, as Nikolai said, and then now he sort of reversed himself. So I'd love to know how that's sort of shifted over time. Is this like a 50-50 thing? Is this a 100-0 thing? And then my second question related to that is, what concretely does Belarus actually get from this, other than ingratiating himself with Putin? Is there something that they're actually getting in an advantage? Can I start on that?
Sure.
So I did an article for IISS on the constitutional changes especially. And so you see after the riots, after the election riots, after the sanctions related to the kidnapping of the activist off the Ryanair EasyJet aircraft, Belarus was hammered. And so Lukashenko had to go to Putin with hat in hand. And that's when, so like a couple of weeks after they met in September 2021, Lukashenko agrees to a new military doctrine to the Union state and visits the Constitutional Court for consultations. And then on the 15th submits the changes to the Constitution, which includes removing the line that Belarus aspires to be a non-nuclear weapons state. There is a clear quid pro quo. He then goes on Russia Today. Lukashenko goes on Russia Today and say, I will now invite Russia to station nuclear weapons on our territory. So Belarus has been asking for the Iskander M since at least 2016. But they've been doing this dance since 1999 with the Union Treaty, where when things are really bad, Lukashenko embraces Putin really hard, and then when things start going well, then he veers back towards the European Union. And the thing that he's resisted all along is the permanent stationing of Russian forces on Belarusian territory, because I think he's recognized all along that that's creeping annexation. And Russia even said in 2017, we're going to establish a joint air base, and Lukashenko went on the air and said, no, we're not. Then there was the joint air patrols, and it was like, yes, but only with temporarily stationed aircraft. As Bill said, this is at least 100 Russian troops on Belarusian territory forever. And that's only if they don't also need to have a couple troops at some of the rail junctions. So you know what I mean? I think this is a classic game where Lukashenko asked for too much, and now Putin's like, Bill's coming due. Mm-hmm. And he has avoided so long this permanent stationing. And now, whether the nukes go in or not, he's got permanent 12th Guma forces on his territory, including response forces who are nothing more than commandos. So, I mean, this is really interesting to me. I think that's an angle. The other angle to look at is, remember Lukashenko, when he first took office, the first thing he did was he stopped the SS-25s from leaving. And Yeltsin and Clinton had to get together and threaten him. Political, economic, military means. So Lukashenko has previous on this going back a long time. Belarus itself, as Sarah pointed out, has a very interesting and mixed record, but Lukashenko's record is pretty spotty. Anyway.
I have a slightly different actually here. Only slightly. Oh, not completely. Yes, Lukashenko has been asking for a lot of kind of things, and he generally talks a lot about a lot of things, and not always that's a real kind of policy. So I think that the decision for Putin actually was one thing to deploy some troops there, aircraft or like whatever in Belarus to enhance integration and everything, but it's pretty clear, at least to me, or from my point of view, that Putin did not want to deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus. So if you talk about percentages, I would say it's almost 100% the decision of Putin. He really went for that. Always in the context of the war that's not going well, in the context of the conflict with NATO and the European Union, yes, and frankly, it's increasingly hard to draw the line. In fact, if you look at all the assistance to Ukraine, what mostly goes through the European Union, is NATO sort of keeps very quiet and really does not take part in the whole operation. It's like an interesting arrangement. So yes, I think it's really Putin who decided to increase the stakes within that game. Yes, and is really going for much more focused nuclear messaging.
If I could, I'll just add a couple of points in terms of Putin and decision making when it comes to nuclear warheads and nuclear weapons in general. Again, the 12th Duma is a very elite organization within the Ministry of Defense. Any decision made about storing weapons, there's no way that would be done without Putin talking to the 12th Main Director and getting their input. That it could be done, and most likely how would it get done before he would make such an announcement. He was personally involved in making decisions on corporate threat reduction and will we continue assistance? Will we get access to the sites? We would have the general 12th Main Director meet with us and go directly to Putin and talk to him about it and get his approval before things would happen. So very much involved in anything having to do with where warheads are stored. He monitored the Bratislava Agreement about getting nuclear security around all of the sites by 2008. We monitored that closely, and we know that 12th Duma would tell us we have to provide a report, and this is the information that we need to report to him. So he watches it closely. This is not something that you give to others.
So I think we're a little bit over already, so I think we'll take the 2 questions online, and if you have any more questions in here, and then we'll wrap up. So maybe the first one, Sarah, you can take a crack at. It says perhaps this is an opportunity to return to the discussion of a nuclear weapon-free zone in Europe. And the second question has to do with, actually there's 3 online. Okay, so we'll have those. Russia is well advanced in electronic warfare, anti-access, air denial systems. Hence, what is the level of cyber cloud radar preparedness? Do you want to take that, William?
No.
And what is the point? There's Poland. What is the point of NATO still restraining itself from extending nuclear sharing to NATO eastern flank countries, while Russia clearly does not reciprocate this self-restraint? Shouldn't NATO do more to deter Russia and prevent Russia from making another grave miscalculation?
That I do.
Okay.
But let's Sarah go first.
Sarah, and then William on at least one of those questions. And if anyone wants to take the
I'd like to say a few words on the last question.
Okay. Bill, first, feel free to jump in if there's something you want to talk about. Sarah, you get the easy question.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Right. Okay. Well, so I appreciate this question because I do think, there are times when the security environment changes in such a way that you think it would merit a certain policy response because it seems very logical. But unfortunately, I think the way that it actually works is that the security environment changes and it limits the kinds of policy responses that people can exercise. And to me, this is an example of precisely that latter phenomenon where, yes, I mean, it might sound very appealing and logical to try to move back towards a conversation about a nuclear weapon-free zone in Europe, especially considering all of the heightened nuclear rhetoric that we've seen around Russia's invasion of Ukraine and everything that has come with it, the sort of increased salience and sensibility about the dangers posed by nuclear weapons among the public and I think policymakers as well. But at the same time, having just had this discussion about Russia potentially deploying non-strategic nuclear weapons in another country, it seems to me like it's going to be an even bigger lift to try to return to a conversation about a nuclear weapon-free zone in that region. So as much as I would like to say, yes, maybe we should be thinking more creatively and outside the box about ways to address these challenges, I think we're also limited by the realities on the ground and the realities of what we're seeing as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that's my sort of pessimistic answer to that great question. Thanks.
So on the first question, I mean, I think if you're talking about Russia's cyber warfare capabilities, I can answer that. I was asking myself, why has cyber not been a bigger part of the conflict? And actually, a couple of my colleagues looked very deeply at what is happening. And actually, there is a stunningly large cyber war going on. And it is perfectly congruent with what we know about the conventional war. In other words, early on, they didn't do as much to destroy infrastructure through cyber means as you would have expected, because they thought they were going to win right away and they would need to turnkey this stuff the next day. So as the war has gone on, Russia has done more and more destructive things against cyber civilian infrastructure. But the fact remains that Ukraine was incredibly prepared for this and working with the NATO allies in order to defend them. So the cyber effectiveness has been less than we might have anticipated, but this war is going on. It's going on every day. There are punches and counter punches going on. Don't assume that because you're not reading about it that it's not happening. It is happening. We have very solid evidence on that. To Archer's question, it's a great question. The question I always have is, what's the effectiveness? Would moving a nuclear weapon, for instance, we had this debate at NATO for a long time, would moving nuclear weapons to Lithuania help you? It pretty much guarantees that every Lithuanian is going to die on the first day of a conflict, unfortunately, because those storage sites are going to have to get hit by absolutely everything. So if you were to design a nuclear posture for the alliance, this is not 1958, so you're not going to put 1,000 nuclear weapons down the inter-German border. You're going to, because we have air-delivered stuff, you're going to try to put it actually further away from the front line so that these aircraft have a chance to get in the air and to deliver their weapons. I do think airdropped bombs is not what you would do. And I do think the alliance should look at different options other than a B-61. Obviously, an F-16 penetrating Russian air defenses and dropping a B-61 is A, not an incredibly likely event, and B, I mean, if you're looking at the PSYOP and you're saying, where in the PSYOP is the option for a German aircraft to take a Tornado to take off and drop a B-61? It's probably pretty low on the PSYOP. F-35 is probably a little bit better, but still, I do think we should be looking at different options for nuclear deterrence other than the B-61. But that can be incredibly difficult. I would say let's make France happy and buy a SAMPA-A's. Buy the French standoff nuclear armed cruise missiles, because those things work pretty well. No, but I do think we need to look at something different than what we do currently have. So Archer, I welcome you and your Polish colleagues leading that debate at NATO.
Can I do a one finger on what William said? Remember, it was about a year ago, there was a Belarus partisan group that disrupted the rail in Belarus. Yeah. That's something to be concerned about if Russia's going to be shipping warheads over rail.
Yeah, that's right. If the war had gone better, I think Belarus would have been integrated earlier, because they would need a massive troop presence in order to suppress not only the potential for partisan action, but actually I don't think they trust the Belarusian military either. So I think in order to absorb or to permanently station nuclear weapons, they would need a much larger Russian occupation force within Belarus to do that integration. I think you're absolutely correct.
In a few words, maybe some deployment on nuclear weapons in Poland. Well, it's always with a balance. From current actual locations, yes, I fully agree with William. B-61s are not really usable, not very credible with nuclear deterrence. On the other hand, if you move them forward, they become quite vulnerable. So it's a balance that's really hard to decide. So it's other options, of course. Slickums, look at everything, you can consider. I would also throw in the political consideration, not just the military. I already mentioned that's in the interest of Russia now to escalate. So I would really say they'd likely welcome an opportunity to escalate if NATO responds in kind. So that would give me a pause, actually, would make me think very hard. Do I really need to respond in kind or not in the current environment? Because I must actually know this, and William might actually even recall that like years ago, I was telling, including to you, that the current actual NATO nuclear posture does not make sense. So yes, I have not changed my view, but we do need also to factor in the political dynamic and the risk of escalation at the present actual moment. So I would, quite honestly, prefer to refrain, at least for now.
I think NTI did a report a number of years ago that said 7 successive miracles would be needed for the weapons. I got comments on the posture.
Yes, but if we talk about the former deployment of Poland alone, is definitely not the right option. Then you also probably need to go to Romania or something like that. So it should be, but at least 2 occasions.
Did you have another question, Hans?
Well, I just think it would be interesting to hear here at the end of it now that everything is going bad. And, the only way that countries seem to be, and increasingly so, dealing with this matter or seeking to deal with this matter is, has a danger of sort of autopilot posturing to it, that they do something. What do we have to do? I mean, we get into that cycle, and it may be hard to come up with fantastic new ideas that would just be breakthroughs that countries would suddenly agree to sit down and agree about. But under the circumstances, one of the questions is, what are the things that we should not do? What are the things we have to be careful about doing so that we avoid being taken down a route where it's harder to get out from? There must be options there. They are not necessarily public options or multilateral options or whatever, but there are certainly decisions that must be made, or considerations that, under the circumstances, try to make it less bad than it otherwise could become. What would some of them be?
I'll take one. I don't want nuclear warheads anywhere near where there's fighting. That's a concern. I worry every day about those warheads stored in Belgorod.
Right.
And Belgorod, that city has had attacks on it with missiles. I would think if I was working in the 12th Main Directorate today, I was like, should we get them out of here for now? It's just not a good place to have them. And if Putin were to listen to that kind of conversation, he should, and I think he would realize he should talk to us if he was going to do something like that, because the movement of warheads in that region could cause other concerns and could cause emergencies and mistakes. So moving warheads out of a war zone and as far away as possible is really an important thing that we should think about, and I hope and wish the Russians would think about it and take some action on it.
Well, I think I can only repeat what I said before. Well, it would be dangerous to join the escalation action pattern. In this situation, it's in the interest of Russia to escalate, and I think that the West simply need to avoid going up these extra stairs and keep the situation under control. Sort of, it takes time. It's actually very hard. It takes a lot of patience, and patience is not the popular commodity these days. But I think, well, if we're talking about success within supporting Ukraine, that success is actually more than a steady line. You see much less in escalation. That would be really rewarding Putin. Where we try to escalate to.
Great. I think that's a good place to close on.
Did Sarah want to come in? Miles.
Joe, sorry, Sarah.
It's okay. The only point I wanted to make, and maybe this is less sort of tidy bow on things than Nikolai just put, but I mean, I do think the challenge here, of course, is that policymakers also have to weigh all kinds of different exogenous and internal factors, including domestic political pressure. So it's very hard, I would imagine, for policymakers to resist feeling like they need to respond to moves that are being made extremely publicly. And so I think that's really where we get ourselves into sort of a dangerous situation here. Is there's the logical answer, which I 100% agree with Bill and with Nikolai, and there's the political answer, which is oftentimes not the most prudent path, because it is attempting to respond to pressures from constituencies and others with parochial interests. So just wanted to throw that in there at the end.
And the other thing is, just to repeat what Rose said earlier, there's this discussion of fail-safe mechanisms, which is something we could talk about. So thanks everyone here and online for participating. First of all, thank our panelists. I'd like to thank Min and Sophia and others who helped put this meeting together. So thanks everyone. Thanks for coming. And we'll do this again soon.